The tension in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her navy blue blazer crisp, her expression calm but determined. Across from her, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, wearing that familiar smirk, the same one that had infuriated millions during his confirmation hearings. What happened next would send shockwaves through Washington and make Crockett a household name overnight. "Congresswoman," Kavanaugh began, his voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude." The room fell silent. Every phone in the gallery started recording. Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a response that would leave Kavanaugh speechless and set the entire internet ablaze. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why this moment mattered so much. Jasmine Crockett isn't your typical politician. At just 42 years old, she's already made waves as one of the most fearless voices in Congress. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, Texas, Crockett built her reputation taking on powerful interests and winning. She didn't come from money or political dynasties. She worked her way through law school, spent years fighting for everyday people in courtrooms across Texas, and earned every single thing she achieved. Her journey to Congress wasn't easy or inevitable. Born in St. Louis and raised in a working-class family, Crockett moved to Texas for college and never left. She put herself through the University of Houston Law Center while working multiple jobs, including waiting tables and tutoring other students. After graduation, she could have joined a big corporate law firm and made serious money. Instead, she chose to open her own practice, focusing on civil rights cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch. For over a decade, Crockett represented clients who had been discriminated against in housing, employment, and voting rights. She won case after case against powerful defendants who thought they could outlast or outspend her. Her reputation grew throughout Texas legal circles as someone who would take on anyone, no matter how powerful, if the law was on her side. Her political career began almost by accident. After winning a major voting rights case that protected polling locations in predominantly black neighborhoods, local Democratic leaders started asking her to run for office. She initially said no, preferring courtroom advocacy to political campaigning. But when she saw how many problems required legislative solutions rather than just legal ones, she finally agreed to run for the Texas legislature. Even in the Texas legislature, Crockett stood out. While other freshman legislators stayed quiet and followed party leadership, she immediately began challenging powerful interests and asking uncomfortable questions. Her legal background made her particularly effective at spotting loopholes in proposed legislation and constitutional problems that others missed. When Crockett speaks, she doesn't use fancy political language or dance around issues. She tells the truth directly and powerfully. That's exactly what made her such a threat to someone like Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, represents everything wrong with the current system. Appointed to the Supreme Court despite serious allegations and a confirmation hearing that showed his true character, Kavanaugh had spent years making decisions that hurt working families while protecting the wealthy and powerful. His privileged background, elite prep schools, Yale University, handed opportunities at every turn, created a man who looked down on anyone who dared question his authority. But here's what made this confrontation so important. This wasn't just about these two individuals. This was about whether someone from Kavanaugh's world of privilege could silence a black woman who had fought her way to Congress. This was about whether the Supreme Court could continue operating without real accountability. And this was about whether Crockett would let Kavanaugh's condescending attitude go unchallenged. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Crockett was testifying about Supreme Court ethics reforms, proposals that would directly impact Kavanaugh and his colleagues. If she backed down now, it would signal that the court was untouchable. But if she fought back successfully, it could change everything. The committee hearing had started normally enough. Crockett was there to discuss her proposed legislation, requiring Supreme Court justices to to follow the same ethics rules as other federal judges. It seemed routine until Kavanaugh decided to make it personal. Congresswoman Crockett, Kavanaugh began, consulting his notes with exaggerated importance. I've reviewed your proposed legislation, and frankly, I'm concerned about whether you fully understand the constitutional separation of powers. The packed committee room, filled with reporters, activists, and political observers, sensed the tension building. Crockett's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kavanaugh's allies smiled knowingly. Crockett responded professionally. Justice Kavanaugh, I appreciate your concerns, but I believe the American people deserve transparency from all branches of government, including the Supreme Court. That's when Kavanaugh's mask started slipping. His voice took on that familiar tone, the same one he'd used during his confirmation hearings when he'd been challenged by senators. Well, Congresswoman, he said, practically sneering, constitutional law is quite complex. Perhaps you should consult with more experienced colleagues before proposing such sweeping changes to how the court operates. The room temperature seemed to drop. Several people in the audience gasped audibly. Even some Republicans on the committee looked uncomfortable with Kavanaugh's obvious disrespect. But Crockett didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. What happened next was what everyone would remember. Kavanaugh, apparently thinking he was winning some kind of debate, decided to go for the kill shot. You know, Congresswoman, I've been studying constitutional law since before you passed the bar exam. Maybe someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude. This isn't a local courthouse in Texas. The insult was clear to everyone in the room. He wasn't just questioning her expertise. He was dismissing her entire background, her intelligence, and her right to be there. The racial and gender undertones were impossible to miss. You could hear a pin drop. Cameras zoomed in on both faces. Crockett's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed with something that made Kavanaugh's supporters suddenly look nervous. But before Crockett could respond, Kavanaugh made an even bigger mistake. Perhaps emboldened by what he thought was his dominance, he decided to double down. Furthermore, he continued, his voice getting louder, I question whether Congress has any business telling the Supreme Court how to conduct itself. We are a co-equal branch of government, not some lower court that answers to politicians. The pause before politicians was deliberate and insulting. He was trying to diminish not just Crockett, but her entire institution. What Kavanaugh didn't realize was that he had just stepped into a constitutional law trap. By claiming that Congress had no oversight authority over the Supreme Court, he was making an argument that even conservative legal scholars would reject. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to regulate the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, through its authority over judicial budgets, court structure, and impeachment. Several constitutional law professors watching the hearing later noted that Kavanaugh's statement revealed either a troubling misunderstanding of separation of powers or a deliberate attempt to mislead the public about the court's accountability. Professor Eleanor Harper of Georgetown Law would later write, Justice Kavanaugh's claim that Congress has no business regulating Supreme Court ethics would have been laughed out of any first-year constitutional law classroom. But in the moment, Kavanaugh seemed to believe his own rhetoric. He sat back in his chair with visible satisfaction, apparently thinking he had delivered a devastating blow to Crockett's entire premise. That's when something shifted in the room. Even some of Kavanaugh's usual allies started looking uncomfortable. The committee chair, a Republican, actually cleared his throat disapprovingly, because Kavanaugh had just made a critical error. He'd given Crockett exactly the opening she needed. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table. The entire room held its breath. Cell phones around the gallery were recording from every angle. This was clearly about to become a moment. Justice Kavanaugh, she began, her voice steady, but carrying an edge that made everyone pay attention. Since you've decided to question my qualifications, let me help clarify a few things for you and everyone watching. She pulled out a folder that her team had prepared, just in case someone tried exactly this kind of attack. You mentioned that you've been studying constitutional law since before I passed the bar. That's interesting because I passed the bar in 2006, which means you think you've been studying constitutional law since. Well, let's see, you graduated from Yale Law in 1990, so that would be about 16 years, you're claiming. The room was dead silent. Even Kavanaugh's smile started to fade. But here's what's really interesting, Justice Kavanaugh. While you were working as a political operative, yes, that's what you were, not a constitutional scholar, investigating political figures and working on partisan campaigns, I was actually in courtrooms defending people's constitutional rights. Crockett opened her folder and began reading from prepared notes. Her legal team had done their homework. Since you brought up experience, let's talk about experience. During my time as a civil rights attorney, I won constitutional cases protecting voting rights, defending free speech, and ensuring equal protection under the law. Real constitutional work in real courtrooms with real consequences for real people. She looked up directly at Kavanaugh, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, your pre-court career was spent doing political opposition research. Not exactly constitutional scholarship, Justice Kavanaugh. The audience was starting to murmur with approval. This wasn't just a response, it was a systematic dismantling. But Crockett wasn't done, not even close. But since we're talking about qualifications and experience, Justice Kavanaugh, let's discuss why we're really here today. You mentioned that the Supreme Court shouldn't answer to politicians, but you know who the Supreme Court should answer to? The American people. Her voice began to rise slightly, gaining power. And the American people deserve to know why you've accepted luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and private jet flights without disclosing them. Violations that would get any other federal judge sanctioned or removed. The room erupted. Gavels banged as people tried to restore order. Kavanaugh's face had gone red. This was not going the way he'd planned. Crockett waited for quiet, then delivered what would become the most quoted part of her response. You want to lecture me about constitutional law, Justice Kavanaugh? Let me give you a constitutional lesson. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, you know, that document you claim to revere, states that civil officers of the United States can be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. She paused, letting that sink in. Taking undisclosed gifts while making decisions that benefit your wealthy friends? That's exactly what the founders had in mind when they wrote those words. Then came the moment that would go viral within minutes. But let's get back to your original point about experience, Justice Kavanaugh. You suggested that maybe someone with more experience should handle constitutional matters. You're absolutely right. Kavanaugh looked confused. Was she agreeing with him? Someone with more experience should be on the Supreme Court. Someone who actually respects the Constitution instead of treating it like a suggestion. Someone who understands that equal justice under law applies to everyone, including Supreme Court justices. Someone who doesn't throw tantrums when asked basic questions about ethics. The reference to his confirmation hearing behavior was unmistakable. The audience was fully engaged now, some people standing to applaud. So here's my question for you, Justice Kavanaugh. If you can't handle basic ethics questions from a congresswoman you think is beneath you, how can the American people trust you to handle the most important constitutional questions of our time? Crockett leaned back in her chair, her voice becoming almost conversational, which somehow made it even more devastated. And one more thing, Justice Kavanaugh. You mentioned this isn't a local courthouse in Texas. You're absolutely right. Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules. Maybe you should try it sometime. The room exploded. People were on their feet, applauding. Social media was already lighting up, and Brett Kavanaugh sat there, his mouth slightly open, looking like someone had just slapped him with a constitutional textbook. The Senate Judiciary Committee room was still buzzing with energy as the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words hung in the air. The applause from the gallery. Law students, civil rights activists, and everyday Americans who had come to watch the ethics hearing continued for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in congressional hearing terms. Security guards, usually stoic, cracked smiles as they watched the organic outpouring of support for Crockett's performance. Even some Republicans on the committee nodded approvingly, unable to deny the masterclass in preparation, intelligence, and courage they had just witnessed. Brett Kavanaugh, meanwhile, sat frozen, his usual confidence shattered, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. When the noise finally died down, Kavanaugh tried to respond. His voice was shaky, a stark contrast to the arrogance he displayed moments earlier. "Congresswoman, the Supreme Court has always maintained its independence," he stammered, but his words sounded weak, defensive. "We follow appropriate guidelines," he continued, though even he seemed to realize how hollow it sounded. Crockett simply smiled, her expression calm but piercing. "I'm sure you do, Justice Kavanaugh. I'm sure you do." The contrast couldn't have been starker. Crockett, composed and commanding. Kavanaugh, flustered and defeated. The room had transformed into something resembling a gladiatorial arena, every seat filled, standing room only stretching along the walls. The press gallery was packed with reporters from every major outlet, their laptops open, fingers racing to live tweet what was clearly a historic moment. One veteran Capitol Hill reporter, Clara Thompson, who had covered hundreds of committee hearings over 2 decades, later said, "I've never felt energy like this before." It wasn't just a political moment, it was a cultural shift. Among the gallery was Lena Carter, a third-year law student from Howard University, who had driven from D.C. specifically to watch the ethics hearing. "I've never seen anything like it," she told reporters afterward. Here was a Supreme Court justice trying to intimidate a black woman, and she dismantled him piece by piece. "I got chills when she delivered that line about Texas judges following ethics rules." Also present was retired federal judge Margaret Ellison, who had served on the bench for 30 years. She was seen nodding approvingly throughout Crockett's response and was overheard telling a colleague, "That's exactly how you handle a bully in robes." I wish more lawyers had her backbone when I was hearing cases. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's dismantling of Kavanaugh was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within 15 minutes of the exchange, Jasmine Crockett was trending #1 on social media. The clip of her saying, "Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules. Maybe you should try it sometime," had already been viewed over 100,000 times. Memes flooded the internet. One showed Kavanaugh with the caption, "When you try to mansplain constitutional law to a constitutional lawyer." Another featured Crockett with the text, "That's how you shut down a Supreme Court bully." But it wasn't just jokes. Legal experts weighed in with serious analysis. Professor Samuel Levine from Harvard Law tweeted, "Congresswoman Crockett just delivered the most effective takedown of judicial arrogance I've ever witnessed. This is what accountability looks like." News networks scrambled to get the story on air. A CNN legal analyst called it a watershed moment for Supreme Court accountability. MSNBC ran the clip on loop with the headline, "Freshman Congresswoman Schools Supreme Court Justice." Even conservative-leaning outlets struggled to defend Kavanaugh's performance. One commentator noted, "Justice Kavanaugh walked into that room overconfident and left looking like he'd been schooled by someone half his age." The Washington Post editorial board later wrote, "Congresswoman Crockett's response to Justice Kavanaugh demonstrated something we rarely see in Washington anymore: preparation, principle, and the courage to speak truth to power." Within hours, Democratic leaders were rallying behind Crockett. The Speaker of the House released a statement. "Congresswoman Crockett exemplified the best of what Congress can be today. Her thoughtful, prepared, and powerful response reminds us why we need more voices like hers in Washington." Progressive organizations seized the moment, with groups pushing for Supreme Court reform adopting the rallying cry. Jasmine Crockett just showed us how to fight back. Perhaps most surprisingly, several moderate Republicans quietly reached out to Crockett's office to discuss her ethics legislation. The moment had shifted the entire debate around Supreme Court accountability. What had started as a routine hearing was now a turning point, with Crockett's performance giving her proposed reforms unexpected momentum. Senators who had previously ignored her bill were now requesting meetings. The public pressure created by her viral moment had given Supreme Court reform real political power for the first time in decades. For Kavanaugh, the impact was far more damaging. Ethics complaints against him surged in the days following the hearing. Legal scholars published detailed analyses of his behavior, with many concluding that his conduct was inappropriate for a Supreme Court justice. According to insider reports, other justices grew concerned about being associated with his public embarrassment. Kavanaugh's questions during oral arguments became noticeably more restrained, as he seemed wary of creating another viral moment of judicial arrogance. The Supreme Court itself faced new scrutiny. Public opinion polls showed increasing support for term limits, ethics requirements, and other reforms. The court's approval rating, already low, dropped further as people began to see it as an unaccountable institution protected by arrogant justices. Crockett, however, didn't let the moment fade. She used her newfound platform strategically. Within days, she introduced expanded ethics legislation that went further than her original proposal. She organized hearings featuring ethics experts who detailed exactly how Supreme Court justices had violated standard judicial conduct rules. She created a public database tracking undisclosed gifts and potential conflicts of interest, ensuring transparency for the American people. Most importantly, she kept the pressure on Kavanaugh specifically. Every time he spoke publicly, Crockett's team was ready with fact checks and context that reminded people of his ethical lapses. Her media appearances became must-watch television. Crockett appeared on every major Sunday talk show, each time armed with specific examples of judicial misconduct, delivered with the same precision that had demolished Kavanaugh. Viewers tuned in because they knew she would offer substantive content rather than typical political talking points. Her momentum attracted high-profile allies. The family of a retired Supreme Court justice released a statement supporting Crockett's reform efforts, noting that their relative had advocated for stronger ethics rules before their death. Constitutional law professors from top universities organized a public letter endorsing her legislation, specifically citing her exceptional command of constitutional principles and judicial ethics. Perhaps most tellingly, Crockett received private support from current federal judges who couldn't speak publicly but were frustrated with the Supreme Court's lack of accountability. Anonymous messages poured into her office from judges across the country, thanking her for saying what they couldn't. Her office also revealed that in the month following the Kavanaugh exchange, they had received over 50,000 individual donations, averaging $47 each. A grassroots fundraising surge that demonstrated genuine public engagement with Supreme Court reform, not just viral entertainment. Conservative media tried to frame Crockett as disrespectful and out of line, but their arguments fell flat. Even many Republicans couldn't defend Kavanaugh's condescending behavior or his ethical lapses. Some conservative commentators praised Crockett's preparation and effectiveness, even while disagreeing with her politics. As one conservative news contributor noted, "I don't agree with her agenda, but I respect her ability to make her case. She did her homework, and it showed." The response from Republican lawmakers was notably muted. Several GOP members of the Judiciary Committee declined to defend Kavanaugh's performance when asked by reporters. Senator Thomas Reed of Texas, normally a reliable conservative voice, said only, "All public officials should maintain appropriate decorum," a statement many interpreted as criticism of Kavanaugh rather than Crockett. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists were reportedly furious with Kavanaugh for creating such a politically damaging moment. One anonymous GOP operative told a major political outlet, "We spend all this time talking about liberal judicial activism, and then one of our own justices goes on TV and acts like he's above basic ethics rules. It's a gift to the Democrats we didn't need to give." The split response revealed deeper tensions within the conservative movement about the Supreme Court's public image. Younger conservative lawyers, particularly those who had to defend the court's legitimacy in academic and professional settings, were especially critical of Kavanaugh's performance. A prominent conservative legal organization, while not officially commenting, reportedly had internal discussions about whether Kavanaugh's behavior was harmful to their broader judicial project. Even traditionally supportive conservative legal blogs struggled to defend the exchange. Several posts attempted to criticize Crockett's grandstanding, but ended up spending more words explaining why Kavanaugh's initial comments were problematic. The difficulty in mounting an effective defense became a story in itself, with legal commentators noting, when your allies can't defend you, you've probably lost the argument. Crockett's moment represented something larger than a single exchange. In an era when institutions seemed untouchable and powerful people faced no consequences, she had shown that preparation, intelligence, and courage could still win the day. Young lawyers, particularly women and people of color, began sharing stories about how Crockett's example inspired them to speak up in their own workplaces. Law schools started using the exchange as a teaching tool for effective advocacy. The moment also highlighted the changing demographics of American politics. Crockett represented a new generation of leaders, diverse, educated, and unintimidated by traditional power structures. Her success signaled that the old guard was finally facing real challenges. As the dust settled, Crockett's profile continued to rise. Speaking requests poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. Her social media following jumped by 200,000 in a single week. But more importantly, her ethics legislation was gaining traction. The viral moment had given her a platform, and she was determined to use it to push for lasting change. 6 months after the electrifying confrontation in the Senate Judiciary Committee room, the impact of Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Brett Kavanaugh was still reverberating through Washington and beyond. What began as a single, fiery exchange had grown into a movement, reshaping the national conversation around Supreme Court accountability and cementing Crockett's place as a transformative figure in American politics. Crockett's ethics legislation, once dismissed as a long shot, had gained unprecedented momentum. The House of Representatives passed her bill with bipartisan support, a rare feat in a deeply divided Congress. Moderate Republicans, swayed by the public pressure and Crockett's undeniable command of the issue, joined Democrats in voting for the measure. In the Senate, where progress had historically stalled on judicial reform, senators who had previously ignored Crockett's proposals were now scheduling meetings with her team. The viral moment had shifted the political calculus, making Supreme Court ethics a priority for lawmakers who could no longer ignore the public's demand for accountability. The legislation itself was a bold step forward. It required Supreme Court justices to adhere to the same ethics rules as other federal judges, including mandatory disclosures of gifts, travel, and financial ties. It also established an independent oversight body to investigate violations, a provision that sent shockwaves through the judicial establishment. Crockett's team worked tirelessly to ensure the bill was airtight, consulting with constitutional scholars and ethics experts to preempt any legal challenges. The public database she had created, tracking undisclosed gifts and potential conflicts of interest, became a cornerstone of the reform effort, providing transparency that Americans had long demanded from their highest court. Crockett's newfound prominence made her a target, but she was ready. Conservative media outlets tried to paint her as an opportunistic grandstander, but their attacks lacked traction. The public had seen the exchange with Kavanaugh, and the evidence of his ethical lapses, luxury vacations, private jet flights, undisclosed gifts, was undeniable. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend him. One prominent legal blogger wrote, "Justice Kavanaugh's behavior in that hearing was indefensible." Congresswoman Crockett didn't just win an argument. She exposed a systemic flaw in judicial accountability. Another conservative pundit, while critical of her politics, admitted she came prepared. You can't fault her for that. Kavanaugh himself had become noticeably more cautious. Sources close to the Supreme Court reported that he had scaled back his public appearances, wary of triggering another viral moment of accountability. His questions during oral arguments grew more restrained, and his influence on the court appeared to wane. Other justices, concerned about the court's plummeting approval ratings, distanced themselves from his public embarrassment. The court's approval rating, already at historic lows, dropped further as public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for reforms like term limits and mandatory ethics rules. One poll found that 73% of Americans now supported term limits for Supreme Court justices, up from 58% before the hearing. Support for ethics requirements jumped from 67% to 81%. Crockett didn't rest on her laurels. She leveraged her platform to keep the pressure on, appearing on news programs, podcasts, and even late-night talk shows to discuss judicial reform. Her ability to break down complex legal issues into clear, compelling arguments made her a sought-after guest. She spoke with the same precision and passion that had defined her confrontation with Kavanaugh, always armed with specific examples of judicial misconduct. Her team's fact-checking operation continued to hold Kavanaugh and other justices accountable, releasing regular updates to the public database that kept the issue in the spotlight. The moment also inspired a new generation of advocates. Young lawyers, particularly women and people of color, cited Crockett's performance as a turning point in their careers. Social media was filled with stories of attorneys standing up to dismissive bosses or challenging unethical practices in their workplaces, inspired by Crockett's fearlessness. Law schools across the country incorporated the Crockett-Kavanaugh exchange into their curricula, using it as a case study in effective advocacy and judicial accountability. The American Bar Association praised her performance, calling it a model for how lawyers should prepare for high-stakes questioning. Internationally, Crockett's approach became a blueprint for reform. Legal scholars in other countries studied the exchange, translating it into multiple languages for use in movements challenging unaccountable judicial systems. In one notable instance, a group of activists in a European nation cited Crockett's strategy as inspiration for their own push to reform a notoriously opaque judiciary. Her name became synonymous with standing up to institutional arrogance, a symbol of what preparation and courage could achieve. Crockett's rising profile sparked speculation about her future. Political insiders began discussing her as a potential candidate for higher office. A Senate run, perhaps, or even Attorney General someday. Some even whispered about her as a future Supreme Court justice, noting her prosecutorial experience, constitutional expertise, and proven ability to confront powerful interests. When asked about these possibilities in interviews, Crockett remained focused on her current work. "I'm here to serve the American people, not to chase titles," she said in one widely quoted interview. "But I won't rule anything out if it means making our system more just." Her office became a hub of activity. Speaking requests poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and grassroots groups. Her social media following continued to grow, surpassing 500,000 in the months following the hearing. The grassroots fundraising surge that began after the confrontation showed no signs of slowing, with her office reporting over 75,000 individual donations, averaging $47 each. The funds fueled her reform efforts, allowing her to hire additional staff to manage the growing public interest in her work. The broader impact of the confrontation extended beyond Crockett's career. It highlighted the changing demographics of American politics, showcasing a new generation of leaders who were diverse, educated, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. Crockett's success sent a clear message. The Old Boys Club was no longer untouchable. Her ability to blend legal expertise with unrelenting advocacy resonated with a public tired of unaccountable institutions. Behind the scenes, Crockett received private support from unexpected quarters. Federal judges, bound by protocol from speaking publicly, sent anonymous messages thanking her for addressing issues they couldn't raise themselves. One such message from a judge in the Midwest read, "Your courage in that hearing gave voice to frustrations many of us have felt for years. Keep fighting." These messages underscored the depth of dissatisfaction within the judiciary itself, where many felt the Supreme Court's lack of accountability undermined the integrity of the entire system. The conservative response to Crockett's rise remained fractured. While some Republicans doubled down on defending Kavanaugh, others quietly acknowledged that his behavior had damaged the court's credibility. Senator Thomas Reed, who had initially offered a tepid comment about decorum, later met with Crockett to discuss her legislation, signaling a willingness to consider reforms. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists grappled with the fallout. One operative told a political outlet, Kavanaugh handed the Democrats a playbook for attacking the court's legitimacy. We're playing defense now, and it's not a good look. The Federalist Society, a bastion of conservative legal thought, remained publicly silent but reportedly held heated internal debates about Kavanaugh's conduct. Younger members, particularly those navigating academic and professional circles, argued that his arrogance had set back their efforts to defend the court's legitimacy. Legal blogs that typically supported conservative justices struggled to craft coherent defenses, often conceding that Kavanaugh's initial comments were ill-advised. Crockett, meanwhile, continued to push the boundaries of what was possible. She introduced additional legislation to strengthen judicial oversight, including a proposal for term limits that gained surprising traction. She organized public forums where ordinary citizens could share their concerns about the Supreme Court, amplifying voices that had long been ignored. Her office released a report detailing the financial ties between justices and wealthy donors, further fueling public demand for reform. The confrontation's legacy was perhaps best captured in Crockett's own words, delivered during a speech at a law school commencement. That day wasn't about me versus Justice Kavanaugh, she said, her voice steady but powerful. It was about whether we're going to accept a system where powerful people think they're above the rules. I'm proud we sent a clear message that we won't. The moment had become more than a viral sensation. It was a symbol of changing power dynamics in American politics. Crockett's expertise, preparation, and courage had exposed the vulnerabilities of an institution long considered untouchable. Her ethics legislation continued to gain support, with polls showing overwhelming public backing for reform. Political observers noted that the exchange had fundamentally shifted how Americans viewed the Supreme Court, with many now seeing it as an institution in need of accountability rather than reverence. As Crockett's star continued to rise, so did the stakes. Her name was floated for leadership roles within the Democratic Party, and her reform efforts inspired a wave of similar proposals in state legislatures. The exchange with Kavanaugh became a touchstone for a new era of advocacy, proving that one voice, armed with facts and fearlessness, could challenge even the most powerful institutions. The old guard, represented by figures like Kavanaugh, was on notice. The rules were changing, and Jasmine Crockett was leading the charge. Whether she would run for higher office or continue her work in Congress, one thing was clear. Her confrontation with Kavanaugh had sparked a movement that would shape American politics for years to come.